The unexpected encounter, it was a rainy evening in San Francisco. The sky was a dull gray blanket, and the streets shimmered with the reflection of passing cars, red taillights glowing in puddles. Inside his car, Sundar Pichai sat in the back seat, quiet and thoughtful. He wasn't wearing a suit today. No one would recognize him. His shirt was simple, slightly wrinkled, the collar soft from use. His pants were plain, not designer. He wore worn-out sneakers, the kind that told stories of long walks and everyday errands. To a stranger, he looked like any ordinary man seeking shelter from the rain, and that was exactly what he wanted. He had made a habit of visiting his own businesses anonymously. Today, it was a luxury restaurant he owned in the heart of the city. Elegant, modern, exclusive. People booked tables weeks in advance. Influencers shared selfies here. Reviews raved about the service, the ambiance, the food. But Sundar knew that appearances could lie. He had built his life on looking deeper, on paying attention to the small details everyone else ignored. As he stepped into the restaurant, the warmth of the lighting and the soft hum of conversation welcomed him. Soft jazz music floated through the air. A chandelier sparkled overhead. The restaurant was full. Couples leaned close. Friends laughed softly over glasses of wine. Business people checked their watches between bites. Everything looked perfect on the surface. But Sundar wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for the truth. He approached the host stand. The young man there gave him a glance and then looked away. No greeting. No smile. Sundar waited a moment, expecting eye contact. Instead, the host whispered something to a server passing by. Then he turned to Sundar and said flatly, "We're fully booked. No walk-ins." Sundar nodded gently. "I understand," he said, "but I'm alone. Is there any chance I could sit at the bar or wait for a cancellation?" The host looked him over again. His eyes scanned Sundar's clothes. The corners of his mouth twitched, almost into a sneer. "This is not that kind of place, sir. We serve a certain kind of clientele." Sundar didn't flinch. He'd heard those words before, years ago, in different accents and different cities. They didn't sting anymore, but they still carried weight. He stepped aside quietly and waited near the wall, pretending to check his phone. Minutes passed. Sundar watched as two men in tailored suits walked in behind him. The same host greeted them with a smile, shook one of their hands, and said, "Welcome back, gentlemen. Your usual table is ready." The men were led in with grace and warmth. It wasn't about space. It was about assumptions. And Sundar was used to that. A waiter approached the host, carrying a tray of empty glasses. The host leaned toward him and muttered, "Keep an eye on that guy. He just walked in off the street." Sundar heard every word. Soon after, the same waiter approached Sundar, frowning. "Sir, unless you're dining with us, we can't have you standing here." Sundar smiled gently. "I'm hoping to have dinner, actually, if possible." The waiter's lips tightened. "We're not a diner. We don't take just anyone." His tone was harsh, almost dismissive. That moment hung in the air like fog. Sundar looked around. Nobody else had noticed. They were too busy enjoying their meals. But inside him something stirred. Not anger, not pride, but a quiet resolve. He wasn't here for recognition. He wasn't here to test anyone. But the truth had shown itself, and he had no intention of walking away from it. He nodded politely. Again. "Thank you," he said softly, and turned to leave. As he passed the kitchen corridor, a loud voice caught his attention. "What do you think you're doing? This isn't your home. Do you want to be fired?" A boy, no older than 18, stood frozen. He wore a kitchen apron too big for his frame, and his eyes were wide with panic. He held a spilled glass of water in one hand, a cloth in the other. The waiter from before was standing over him, shouting, in low, angry tones. "I'm sorry," the boy whispered. "I didn't mean to drop it. I'll clean it up." "You'll clean up or you'll pack up. Your choice," the waiter snapped. Sundar watched quietly, his hand on the exit door. He remembered being that boy. He remembered being scolded for tiny mistakes. working hard just to get by, feeling invisible in rooms filled with power. His heart tightened. He stepped back inside. The waiter noticed and narrowed his eyes. "I told you." Sundar raised a hand, calm and respectful. "I'd like to speak with the manager, please." "About what?" the waiter said, arms crossed. "About the way people are treated here," Sundar replied, his tone steady. The waiter hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Finally, he walked off, muttering under his breath. The young busboy looked at Sundar with wide, confused eyes. "Thank you, sir," Sundar smiled softly. "What's your name?" "Arjun," the boy replied. "I just started last week." "You're doing fine, Arjun," Sundar said. "Don't let someone else's anger change who you are." A few minutes later, the manager arrived, tall, polished, with a sharp suit and colder eyes. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, scanning Sundar from head to toe. "Yes," Sundar said quietly. "I've seen two people treated unfairly in the last 10 minutes. One of them is me. The other is that boy." The manager's face remained unreadable. "This is a high-end restaurant, sir. We have standards. Sometimes that means making decisions quickly." "Standards and kindness are not enemies," Sundar said. "They should walk together. I'm afraid we don't have time for lectures, and if you're not a customer, I'll have to ask you to leave." Sundar looked him in the eyes, not with anger, not with pride, just a simple, honest look. "Very well," Sundar said. "I'll leave, but you should know, this place belongs to me." The manager blinked, confused, then scoffed. "Excuse me?" "My name is Sundar Pichai," he said gently. "This restaurant is one of many in a group I privately own. I came here tonight to understand how my staff treats people when no one is watching." The silence that followed was thick enough to hold. The waiter who had insulted him earlier stood frozen a few steps away, a plate in hand. The host had gone pale. The manager's face twitched with panic. But Sundar didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten or gloat. He turned to Arjun and said, "If you're free after your shift, I'd like to talk with you about your goals. I think you have potential." Then he turned back to the manager. "Tomorrow we're going to have a conversation, not just about what happened here, but about what needs to change, for everyone." And with that, he stepped back out into the rain. As the door closed behind him, the soft jazz music faded. The storm outside had less noise than the silence he left behind. But inside the restaurant, hearts were racing, and nothing would be the same again. Unveiling the truth, the next morning arrived slowly. The city, still soaked from the night's rain, stretched awake under a gray dawn. In the quiet corner of his study, Sundar Pichai sipped black tea, his eyes focused on the window, but his mind elsewhere. The events of the previous evening played through his thoughts again and again, not with bitterness, not with frustration, but with a quiet sense of purpose. Something had been revealed, not just about a restaurant, but about how quickly people make decisions based on appearance. And deeper than that, how pain, pride, and fear often live in the shadows of behavior. He didn't sleep much. Not because he was angry. He wasn't. But because something inside him refused to stay still. It was a memory, tugging at his heart. Him standing in a classroom without electricity as a child, sharing a wooden desk with 3 others, dreaming of things far beyond the dusty windows. No one had seen potential in him back then. No one had expected much. But a few kind souls had given him chances, and that made all the difference. Now it was his turn to pass it forward. By noon, Sundar walked quietly into the same restaurant. This time there was no storm outside, only silence inside. Word had spread, not officially. No emails had been sent, but everyone knew. The manager, David, stood waiting by the entrance, his posture stiff, his face nervous. Behind him, the waiter from last night, Alan, stood pale and quiet, eyes darting downward. The air was thick with awkwardness. "Good afternoon," Sundar said with calm grace. "Thank you for meeting me." David cleared his throat. "Mr. Pichai, first, allow me to apologize for what happened yesterday. We didn't know." Sundar stopped him with a raised hand. It's not about knowing who I am. That's not the point. I came as a customer. And what happened to me, more importantly, what happened to the boy, Arjun, matters even if I were nobody. There was silence. Thick, uncomfortable, but necessary. Believe, Sundar continued, that the culture of a place is built not on what happens when things go well, but on what happens when no one thinks they're being watched. What I saw, it wasn't just rudeness. It was a symptom of something deeper, and I'd like to understand it better. He turned to Alan, the waiter. Will you speak with me privately? Alan hesitated, his jaw tensed. For a moment, it looked like he might say no, but then, without lifting his eyes, he nodded. They sat in a quiet corner of the restaurant, away from the dining area. The place was empty. It didn't open until evening. The lights were soft. The hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen was the only sound. Sundar sat comfortably, no power in his posture, just a sense of being present. I'm not here to punish you, he said gently. I want to understand, because anger often hides pain, and disrespect often hides fear. You didn't know who I was, so your reaction was honest, and that's what I want to understand. Alan swallowed. He looked away. For a long time, he said nothing. Then finally, his voice low, he said, I wasn't always like this. Sundar waited. 2 years ago, Alan began. I had a family, a wife, a daughter. I worked at a different restaurant, smaller place. I was proud of what I did. I treated customers well. I cared. I smiled. He paused. A breath caught in his throat. Then the pandemic hit. We lost everything. My job, our apartment, my wife. She left. She took my daughter with her, said I wasn't the man she married anymore, said I had too much anger, too much shame. He looked at Sundar then. His eyes weren't cold anymore, they were full, heavy. She was right. I did change. I got bitter, angry. But it wasn't at her. It was at myself. I couldn't fix anything, couldn't provide. Every day I felt smaller. So when I finally got this job, I promised myself I wouldn't lose it. And I built walls. I started pushing people away. Anyone who looked weak, like that kid, or out of place, like you last night. It made me feel in control, like I belonged here, like I was someone. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Sundar nodded slowly. Thank you, he said, for being honest. Alan shook his head. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not offering forgiveness, Sundar replied softly. I'm offering a choice. Alan looked confused. You can keep going like this, live in fear, let pain drive your actions, or you can do the hard thing, change, learn, grow. I can help with that, but it has to come from you. Alan blinked. Why would you help someone like me? Because, Sundar said, someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it either. The door behind them creaked. It was Arjun. He stepped in, awkward and shy, holding a notebook. They said you wanted to see me, sir. Sundar stood. Yes, Arjun, come sit with us. They sat together, 3 very different men from 3 very different paths. But in that moment they shared something human, something raw, something real. Sundar looked at Arjun. What are your dreams? Arjun hesitated, then whispered, to finish school. Maybe start my own cafe one day. What's stopping you? Money, Arjun said. Time, belief. Well, Sundar smiled, let's work on changing that. He turned to both of them. I'm going to set up something new, a mentorship and training program here, not just for staff, for people who want to grow. We'll teach not just how to serve food, but how to lead with respect, how to listen, how to rise. Alan looked stunned. Why? Because, Sundar said, this restaurant doesn't just serve meals, it serves people. And every person who walks in, whether a customer or staff, deserves dignity. For the first time, Alan's shoulders lowered, just a little. But, Sundar added, this isn't charity. It's a responsibility. I'll give you both a chance. But you'll have to work harder than ever. Not to impress me, but to become the kind of men who lift others instead of pushing them down. He stood up slowly. Our past may explain us, but it doesn't define us. We do that, with every choice we make. As Sundar walked out of the restaurant, the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, just a little light warming the street. Behind him, Alan and Arjun sat together, two people who might never have spoken, now beginning a new chapter, but far from over, because just down the street someone had posted a video online. A guest at the restaurant the night before had recorded. The moment when Alan insulted Sundar and Arjun was humiliated. The clip had gone viral. Views were climbing by the minute. Thousands of people now watched, commented, and shared their outrage. And by sunset, the reputation of the restaurant, once a symbol of perfection, was under fire. Understanding the pain by morning, the story had caught fire. The video had traveled through every corner of the internet. On social media, it had been shared by influencers, reposted by journalists, and dissected by angry commentators. It was grainy footage, taken from the corner of the restaurant, blurry, shaky, but painfully clear in its message. In it, Alan's harsh words cut through the warm ambiance of the luxury restaurant, the way he dismissed Sundar, the way he barked at Arjun, and finally the moment when Sundar quietly revealed his identity, leaving everyone in stunned silence. The caption read, "Waiter insults man at luxury restaurant. Turns out he owns the Yanir place." The comments exploded. This is why you treat everyone with respect. That waiter should be fired immediately. CEO of Google? Wow, classy guy. Handled it better than I would have. Poor kid. Someone give that busboy a scholarship. The restaurant's page was flooded with negative reviews. 1 star. Ratings. Boycott calls. Some users went even further, demanding the names of the waiter and manager, hunting them down with digital torches. Online justice was swift, but Sundar knew that rage rarely leads to change. It simply burns and then it moves on. He sat in his office, holding his phone loosely, reading the messages in silence. His assistant knocked softly and stepped in. Press is requesting a statement, sir. CNN, BBC, Reuters, they all want to comment. Not yet, Sundar said calmly. We're not going to react. We're going to respond. He stood and looked out the window, watching people rush through the city, all in a hurry, all carrying burdens invisible to the world. He thought of Alan, of Arjun, of how easily we throw stones without knowing the weight someone already carries. What the world had seen in 20 seconds was only one layer of a much deeper story. Later that afternoon, Sundar returned to the restaurant. It was closed for the day. The doors were locked, the windows covered with brown paper. Inside, Alan sat alone at one of the empty tables. He hadn't slept. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the messages flooding his phone. Hate, threats, curses. It was overwhelming. His shame, already deep, had turned into something heavier, something darker. He looked up when Sundar entered. I deserve this, Alan whispered. You deserve the consequences of your actions, Sundar said gently, but not the destruction of your soul. Alan's eyes filled with tears, but he wiped them away quickly. They want me gone. People are calling me a monster. My daughter's school sent a message to my ex-wife. They think I'm dangerous. Do you believe you are? Sundar asked. Alan shook his head, but weakly. I don't know anymore. I just know I'm tired. Sundar pulled out a chair and sat across from him. The table between them was bare. No menus, no silverware. Just two men facing the truth. Alan, Sundar said, you did something wrong. No question. But hiding in shame won't fix anything. You need to understand why it happened, and then you need to decide who you want to become next. Alan didn't speak. So Sundar continued, "You told me about your past, your pain, your fear. Those things are real. They explain your anger, but they don't excuse it. We've all suffered. We've all failed. I've been humiliated more times than I can count. I was rejected by companies that didn't even read my resume. I've been looked down on for my accent, my skin, my silence. But I chose not to let those things define me. And you can choose too." Alan looked up. "I don't know how." "Then let's learn together," Sundar said. "Not just you, all of us. This restaurant is going to become something more, not just a place for food, but a place for transformation. We're starting a new training program, mandatory for everyone. Emotional intelligence, communication, leadership. It starts with you and Arjun." Alan blinked. "You're including me?" "Yes," Sundar said, "if you're willing to face the mirror and rebuild." Alan nodded slowly. For the first time, he didn't look ashamed. He looked unsure. And that was a start. Arjun arrived shortly after, holding his notebook again. His face was brighter today, but still cautious. Sundar greeted him warmly. "Arjun," he said, "you're going to be the first participant in something new. I've spoken to the board. We're creating a scholarship for employees like you. You'll work part-time, but you'll also study. Business, leadership, whatever you want." Arjun's eyes widened. "Really? Why me?" "Because you didn't give up. Even when you were shouted at. You stood your ground. You cleaned up the mess. You stayed kind. That's what leadership looks like." Arjun smiled, and for a moment, something shifted. Hope, blooming where only fear had lived. As they began planning the first workshop, Sundar's assistant entered, with a laptop. "Sir, you may want to see this." She placed the screen on the table. It was another video. New. Posted just minutes ago. Not from the restaurant this time, but from the restaurant's kitchen. A behind-the-scenes clip showing the chaos of the last week. The title read, "Is the restaurant's owner just playing a good guy? Is it all for publicity?" The video questioned Sundar's motives. It claimed the story was staged, that Sundar only showed up to create a viral moment. It twisted his kindness into performance, and the comments were already flooding in. Another billionaire trying to look good. They probably planned the whole thing. "This is just PR. Don't fall for it." Sundar closed the laptop. He didn't need to read more. Alan looked at him. "They're turning on you." "They don't know me," Sundar said, "but that's okay. Truth isn't a performance, it's a process, and we're just beginning." But inside he felt the weight of something deeper. People wanted stories, yes, but only simple ones. Heroes and villains, right and wrong. But real life wasn't like that. Real life was messy, full of broken people trying to be whole, and the internet didn't care about nuance. Still, Sundar had made his choice. He would keep building, keep listening, keep showing up, but the storm outside was growing. Facing new challenges, the storm didn't slow down. It gathered speed. By midweek, headlines were everywhere. Tech CEO faces backlash over viral restaurant incident. News outlets dissected every frame of the original video and the new one. Commentators debated his sincerity on talk shows. Podcasts asked, was this an act of humility or just strategic image repair? People wanted simple answers, and they wanted them now. But Sundar Pichai had never believed in simple answers. Life was never just one thing. People weren't, either. Still, the pressure was building, and it wasn't just online anymore. Outside the restaurant, news vans began to appear. A few protesters held signs accusing the restaurant of discrimination. Some shouted for boycotts. Even though Sundar had spoken with Alan and Arjun, even though he had already begun working on deep structural changes inside the company, it felt like the world didn't want to hear about the effort. Only the mistake. Inside the restaurant, the staff moved quietly, nervously. The place that had once buzzed with laughter now whispered with tension. Some staff were scared. Others were angry. A few even resented Sundar, believing that the attention he had drawn was hurting their livelihoods. "We're getting punished for one guy's mistake," one server muttered in the break room. "I didn't insult anyone. Why are we all suffering?" Another nodded. "This was one of the best-paying jobs I've ever had. And now, we might shut down." Sundar knew morale was slipping. The harder thing was, he understood their fear. The media never looked past headlines, and for most people, nuance was just too slow to keep up with the speed of outrage. That afternoon, Sundar called a staff meeting. Every chair in the restaurant was filled. Waiters, kitchen workers, cleaners, hosts, everyone. No cameras, no microphones, just people and truth. He stood at the front, his voice calm but unwavering. "I know this week has been hard. Harder than it should be. I know you're afraid. Some of you think we're not going to survive this. That maybe this whole thing has broken something we can't fix." The room was silent, eyes locked on him. "But let me say this clearly," Sundar continued. "We're not here to be perfect. We're here to be better. Every single one of us." The video that went viral, it hurt, but it also revealed something we needed to see. We judged a customer based on his clothes. We yelled at a teenage employee for a minor spill. That is not the kind of place I want to run, and I don't believe that's the kind of place you want to work in. He let the silence stretch, not out of awkwardness, but because silence allowed truth to breathe. "But here's what I know," he said. "You are not your worst moment. None of us are. What matters is what we do next, how we rebuild, how we grow." He pointed gently toward the kitchen. "Alan is still here. He's going through training. He's meeting with mentors every day. He's facing consequences, but he's also choosing growth. And Arjun? He's working with us on a new scholarship fund for entry-level employees who want to finish school. We've already raised enough to sponsor 3 people this year. That's not a punishment. That's a beginning." A few staff looked surprised. A few leaned forward. Something was shifting. "This restaurant," Sundar said, "isn't just a business, it's a mirror. And now we're seeing what's inside. I'm not asking you to ignore what happened. I'm asking you to decide. Are we going to be the kind of people who hide from hard conversations? Or are we going to become a place that people trust, not because we're flawless, but because we're real?" One hand went up. It was Maya, one of the longest-serving waitresses. "But what if it doesn't work?" she asked quietly. "What if we change and people still don't forgive us?" Sundar nodded. "That might happen. Some people won't. Come back. Some will keep believing the worst. But we're not doing this for applause. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do." He stepped back and looked around the room. "I believe in every one of you. And if you're willing, we'll make this place something the world's never seen before. Not just a luxury restaurant, but a place of second chances, growth, and truth." There was no applause, no cheer. But there was something more powerful. Quiet agreement. Heads nodding slowly. People exchanging glances not of fear but of understanding. The next morning, the team began the first in-house training session. Sundar brought in a speaker, an old friend of his, a woman who had grown up in foster care and now ran leadership programs for hospitality workers. Her words weren't corporate, they were human. She spoke about listening before reacting, about treating customers as people, not profiles, about how trauma affects behavior, and about how kindness wasn't weakness. It was power. During a break, Arjun stepped forward shyly. He held a page from his notebook where he had sketched out a new idea for how guests could give anonymous feedback directly to staff in real time through a tablet system. No names, just thoughts. Honest, helpful, direct. "I think it might help us hear what people are feeling," he said softly, "before it ends up on social media." Sundar took the paper and smiled. "This is brilliant." He handed it to the training coordinator. "Let's build this." By the end of the week, a new energy was building. The staff began smiling again. Not the forced, fake kind, but real ones. People lingered after shifts, talking about ideas. Even Alan had started helping new servers, showing them better ways to manage stress during rush hours. But just when things seemed to be turning around, another challenge emerged. An inspector from the city's health department arrived without warning. A surprise check. They went through every corner of the restaurant. Kitchen, storage, restrooms, fridge temperatures, staff hygiene records. 3 hours later, the report was posted, and the result wasn't good. Minor violations. Some expired ingredients. A leak in the back storage area. Nothing dangerous, but enough to lead to a warning. If not fixed within 7 days, the restaurant could be temporarily shut down. Sundar sat alone in the kitchen after everyone had left, staring at the report. He wasn't angry. He was tired. Tired in a deep, quiet way. It felt like no matter how many fires he put out, another one waited. But then he looked at the wall, where Arjun's sketch had been pinned up. And he remembered something he once told a group of students. When it gets hard, that's when it matters most. Anyone can lead in comfort. Real leaders show up in the storm. He stood up and grabbed his phone. We're staying open, he texted the team, but we're going to fix this together, because the story wasn't over, and the test was only just beginning. Rebuilding from within, the next morning didn't begin with sunlight. It began with movement, before the city had fully opened its eyes, before commuters flooded the sidewalks, and coffee shops unlocked their doors. Sundar Pichai stood inside the restaurant, dressed not in a suit, not as a CEO, but in jeans, sneakers, and a plain white shirt. In his hands he held a mop and a checklist. Beside him, Arjun was already setting up the cleaning supplies. Alan stood nearby, sleeves rolled up, eyes focused, holding a toolbox instead of a tray. The report from the health inspection had been a gut punch. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was real. The leak in the back storage room had grown worse overnight, dripping steadily onto cardboard boxes of spare menus and unused glassware. The fridge in the prep station had one faulty temperature reading. Expired condiments were tucked in the back corner of the pantry, overlooked in the rush of everyday service. Small things, but together they painted a picture of carelessness. And carelessness, Sundar knew, always started from the top. Instead of hiring a professional cleaning crew or outsourcing the repairs, Sundar made a decision that morning, one that would ripple through every corner of the restaurant. We're fixing it ourselves, he told the team the night before. Because culture isn't what we say, it's what we do, and it starts right here, with our hands, our effort, our pride. By 7 a.m., nearly the entire staff was present. Some looked groggy, others unsure. But they came. Not because they were paid extra, not because they were told to, but because something in them had begun to change. There was no longer a sense of working for the restaurant. Now they were working with it. Maya, the senior waitress, took charge of organizing storage. She brought in her own label maker and extra shelving bins from home. We used to keep everything in chaos, she muttered as she worked. Not anymore. Arjun moved between stations, helping wherever he could. He rewrote the cleaning rotation, chart by hand, and taped it to the back of the staff room door. When asked why, he simply said, "No more confusion. We can't afford it." Alan, once the most bitter voice in the building, climbed under the sinks and repaired a loose faucet. No one had noticed for weeks. His hands got scraped, his back ached, but he didn't complain. And Sundar? He never stopped moving. When someone dropped a tray of utensils, he picked them up. When the delivery truck was late, he made the call himself. When the refrigerator, thermometer needed replacement, he didn't delegate. He installed the new one himself. This wasn't about appearances. It wasn't about optics. It was about message. You build trust not with words, but with your sweat. By lunchtime, the mood in the restaurant had shifted. People laughed while working. Someone brought in homemade snacks. Stories were shared. Past mistakes were confessed, not with shame, but with the relief of being heard. Sundar sat with small groups during breaks, listening more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was always grounded, gentle, personal. He told them stories from his early days at Google, how he once presented an idea that got completely shut down by a room full of executives. How, instead of retreating, he refined the idea, came back stronger, and built what would eventually become Chrome. Failure, he said, is just a mirror. Sometimes it shows us what needs changing. Sometimes it shows us what we already have inside. And then, something unexpected happened. Just before closing time, a local news reporter entered the restaurant. With a cameraman. Not for a hit piece, not for another opinion segment. She had heard from a former customer who'd walked by earlier that day and seen staff cleaning, fixing, laughing. She wanted to understand what was happening behind the scenes. Sundar didn't give her a press statement. Instead, he invited her to join the team in the kitchen. She sat with Maya as she organized the spice shelves. She talked to Arjun about his scholarship dream. She watched as Alan trained a new server with patience that surprised even himself. The next day, her story aired under a different headline. A restaurant in crisis, rebuilding with its own hands. The tone was different. Human. Complex. True. The clip didn't go viral. Not like the first video, but that was okay. Sundar didn't want a spotlight, he wanted roots, and roots grow slowly. The next few days brought new energy. The tablet-based feedback system Arjun had sketched out went live. Customers could now rate their experience anonymously and send direct, private notes to the staff. The first responses came in trickles. The waiter was kind but seemed nervous. Maybe too much pressure on him. Love the new changes. Things feel more genuine. Didn't expect to enjoy a place this much after everything I read. But amid the hope, the pressure remained. The 7-day deadline was fast approaching. The health department would return for re-inspection soon. Failure meant temporary closure, and with it financial risk, media backlash, and the possible end of everything they had worked for. On the 6th night, after everyone left, Sundar remained behind. He walked the length of the restaurant alone, table by table, chair by chair, not inspecting, listening, absorbing the silence, the weight of the work they had done. He paused at the very table where Alan had insulted him. He sat down in the same chair. This was where it had all started. Not with drama, not with ego, but with a quiet refusal to walk away. He leaned forward, hands resting on the table. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that someone else had just made a decision. A food critic, well-known, respected, sharp. He had read about the scandal, dismissed it at first, but then he saw the second article, and then the third, and he began to wonder, not about the food, but about the people. And without telling anyone, he made a reservation for Friday night, the same night the health inspector would return. 2 storms, 1 evening, 1 truth to face. The ultimate test Friday came, dressed in stillness. The morning sun crawled slowly over San Francisco's skyline, casting long shadows across the restaurant's front windows. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavier than it ever had. Not with fear, but with focus. The silence was different now. It didn't feel like dread. It felt like breath held in quiet anticipation. Like the pause before music begins, or the space between thunder and rain. Sundar Pichai stood at the back of the restaurant next to a small storage door they'd fixed earlier in the week. It had been repainted, its hinges oiled. Nothing extraordinary about it. But it was a symbol, a small overlooked detail that now shone clean and smooth, because people had cared enough to fix it. Tonight, 2 defining events would unfold. First, the city's health inspector would return to evaluate whether the violations from last week had been addressed. They needed to pass, not just to stay open, but to prove to themselves that discipline and accountability could restore what had been lost. Second, the unannounced guest was coming, a food critic whose reviews could lift a restaurant to stardom or bury it in silence. No one on the staff knew. Sundar hadn't told them, not to protect them from pressure, but to protect the honesty of their service. If they were going to succeed, it had to be real, not rehearsed. Not performed. Lived. The staff began to arrive, one by one, dressed with care, their eyes sharp, their movements calm but deliberate. Arjun walked in holding his notebook, pages dog-eared from use. He gave Sundar a quiet nod before hurrying off to check the new digital feedback stations. Alan arrived next, hair neatly combed, his face calm but focused. He greeted everyone, even those he used to ignore. Not with overcompensating smiles, but with sincerity. Quiet, steady, earned. Maya was already setting the tables. She'd insisted on doing it herself. The napkins were folded perfectly, the centerpieces polished, no shortcuts. Every detail speaks, she had said earlier that week, and we want ours to say we're ready. By 5 p.m., everything was in place. Then, just after 6:15, the health inspector arrived. She was quiet, professional, clipboard in hand, eyes moving quickly. She walked through every part of the kitchen. She asked questions, lifted containers, opened drawers. She moved with the kind of precision that could make even confident people sweat. Sundar stayed back, watching from a distance, not interfering. This wasn't his test alone. It belonged to everyone who had put in the hours, scrubbed the walls, reviewed the systems, and carried their weight. After nearly an hour, the inspector returned to the front, called Sundar over, and handed him the new report. She didn't smile. She simply said, "You passed. All violations corrected. Good work." He nodded quietly. "Thank you." And just like that, the first storm passed. Quietly. No applause. No celebration. Just the satisfying ache of earned relief. But there was no time to rest. At 7:45, the door opened. The critic entered. He didn't look like a critic. No notebook. No camera crew. Just a man in a dark blue jacket, with sharp but curious eyes scanning the room without expression. He asked for a table in the corner, away from the crowd. Maya greeted him without knowing who he was. Offered him water, recommended a few specials, treated him like anyone else. Not because she was trained to, but because she meant it now. Alan served his table. His voice was measured, respectful. No fear. He answered every question clearly. No fluff, no charm, just clarity and care. The critic ordered the house signature dish. He also requested something not on the menu, a common test in his world. Alan didn't hesitate. He went straight to the chef and asked. Within 10 minutes, the plate was delivered exactly as requested. Throughout the night, the critic barely spoke. He took his time, watched everything, not just the service at his own table, but the rhythm of the room, the energy of the staff, the unspoken communication between people who had learned to move together, not out of obligation, but out of shared commitment. Arjun approached his table near the end and politely asked if everything had been satisfactory. The critic looked up, paused, and simply said, "Yes, very." Then he left. No drama, no identity reveal. No handshake or business card, just silence again. That night when the restaurant closed, Sundar gathered everyone around. The lights were dimmed. The chairs were still tucked neatly under the tables. "Tonight," he began, "you showed something rare. Not perfection, but something better. You showed consistency, humility, effort, and grace." His eyes moved across the room at Alan, who stood quietly in the back, arms crossed, face peaceful. At Maya, who had tears in her eyes for reasons even she couldn't explain. At Arjun, who stood with his notebook heart wide open. "This place," Sundar said, "used to be defined by Polish. Now it's defined by people." He paused, not to emphasize a point, but because his voice caught, not with emotion, with pride. "I can't promise the world will understand. Some people will always doubt us, some will always remember the old video and not the new story. But I promise you this. If we keep showing up like this every shift, every moment, we won't just have customers. We'll have community. We won't just serve food. We'll serve meaning." Everyone stood in silence. No one needed to clap. But before they could part for the night, Arjun's phone buzzed. He looked down and gasped. "Sir," he said, eyes wide. "It's live." He turned the phone around. The critic's review had just been posted. The headline read, "Not the perfect restaurant, but the most honest one I've seen in years." The review was glowing, not because everything was flawless, but because everything felt real. It described the warmth of the staff, the attention to detail, the subtle tension in the air that made the experience human, not manufactured. He wrote, "I went expecting a performance. What I found was a place full of people who had chosen to grow instead of hide. There was no script, just sincerity, and that's rarer than good food." As the staff gathered around to read, there were tears, laughter, silence again. But most of all, there was peace. Outside, the city lights twinkled. Cars passed, rain returned, light and gentle. Inside, Sundar sat down for a quiet meal, alone at the same table where the story began. Not as the owner, not as the CEO, not even as the man who had changed the course of a business, but as someone who knew, now more than ever, that real leadership begins, not with being seen, but with seeing others, and choosing, again and again, to believe they can become more.